President Trump's Federal Reserve picked Judy Shelton's nomination. It appears to be in trouble. Three key GOP senators are expressing concerns about her, quote, outlier as an outlier. Does it really mean that the Fed won't ever get the accountability that many believe it should have? Here to weigh in, Texas Congressman Chip Roy. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Charles, good to be on. How are you? I'm
great. And, you know, you've always been a very vocal about matters of the Federal Reserve and debt and like that. So I thought you were the perfect guest to have on about this. You know, of course, Judy Shelton, she's had some ideas in the past, including the gold standard. But, you know, should everyone at the Federal Reserve think the same?
No, they shouldn't. I think this is a classic example of the swamp being the swamp, right? You've got a president who's within his rights to nominate somebody who's obviously got a great deal of experience and who's built a career on questioning the Fed, I think appropriately. I think we need accountability at the Fed. I obviously support legislation that would have an audit of the Federal Reserve. I think that's necessary and needed. But here's what's really important. We don't need a Federal Reserve that's more interested in creating policies that enriches the financial sector instead of creating an overall stable policy so that we can have strong economic growth and have sound money. And look, Ms. Shelton has talked about sound money her entire career. They try to pigeonhole her as some sort of kook attached to the gold standard. First of all, the gold standard is a reasonable thing for us to debate and consider. But putting that aside, shouldn't we all be desiring sound money and stability rather than just waiting with bated breath as to what the Federal Reserve Chairman and the Federal Reserve Committee is going to decide that what interest rates are going to be and go through the yo-yo of our economic conditions? I think it'd be wise for us to have somebody like Ms. Shelton at the Federal Reserve who's questioning the orthodoxy there, especially when we see what we're dealing now with $23.2 trillion of debt.
Yeah, I just picked up the biography on Badgett yesterday, started thumbing through it. You know, of course, he wrote a famous book on central banks years ago, and he's well regarded. And it just seems to me, and you brought this up, the idea of a central bank whose sole goal is to protect the ultra wealthy and big banks. Like it's hard to see where they really are focused on Main Street. They say they are, but it feels like anytime they go into action, it's really at the behest or to save the big banks. The mistakes often that big banks bring on themselves.
Well, yeah, and we saw this, of course, just over a decade ago with the collapse in the financial sector. And look, I worked at a bank. I worked for Nations Bank Capital Markets, now part of Bank America Securities, back in my youth. And look, I'm a big believer in making sure we have strong financial institutions, but those need to be a part of the overall fabric of our economy. We shouldn't have a Federal Reserve whose sole purpose and function is to focus on financial institutions and creating wealth in that sector, rather than a stable monetary policy, sound money that creates a strong economy, so that our laborers can prosper and so that manufacturing can prosper. This is a very Trumpian and populist worldview. I think it's somewhat classic that the swamp is biting back.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised they're fighting back. And maybe we've crossed the Rubicon real quick because it's important. The Secretary of Defense defending his decision to divert billions of dollars in funding from military funding to help pay for President Trump's border wall. Is this the right call, Representative Roy?
Well, look, I first of all believe very much that we ought to be very careful about allowing the executive branch to just spend money without accountability to Congress. And I've introduced legislation to not have emergencies run for years on end. But the president is right that there's an emergency at our border, and the Democratic Congress has refused to acknowledge it. And yes, we're making some progress. We've got 100 miles of fence being built. The president says we'll have 400 to 500. But here's what's really important. Cartels still have operational control of our border. We just caught 198 people over the last, I think, month by our Border Patrol who are affiliated with dangerous gangs and MS-13. The Reynosa faction of the Gulf Cartel and the Cartel de Noreste are warring right on the southern border along the Rio Grande. Wow. Our Border Patrol don't have the resources they need to combat it. So we're relying on Mexico right now because the president's been working with them to do our work that we should be doing. But our Democrat colleagues refuse to help us. So the president's doing what he can, acknowledging that there's a true crisis at our border, using the resources he can to build the wall. Right. But we need to go further and fix the solution for the future.
Congressman Roy, I really enjoy our conversations. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Charles.